Jan Becker is the CEO of Apex.ai. He's an absolute expert in software development. And Jan, I love having the opportunity to talk with you because, as you know, all the automakers are moving to software-defined vehicles, and they all seem to be struggling with it. And in fact, they just seem to have software struggles in abundance, let's put it that way. And you've got some really astute observations as to what especially the legacy automakers need to do when it comes to software development. Can you fill us in with some of those details?
Yeah, John, nice to see you again, and thanks for having me on the show. Of course I can. Car makers, automakers are typically huge organizations with a great history in designing cars, manufacturing cars, often to perfection. But that's typically a different culture, a different development culture than software development. Software is actually never finished. Software is typically developed in iterations. You design software, you build software, you test, you change, you add features. The smartphone, the IT and smartphone industry has really driven software development to a point where everybody has a smartphone in their pocket, and you buy an Android phone or an iPhone, and then you download apps, and you download apps after you've bought the device. So that creates an expectation that the functionality on the device grows over its lifetime, also that software gets updated, that features gets added, that bugs get fixed. And that the car is becoming a computer, actually a smartphone on wheels. So that expectation, that consumer expectation, then transfers to the car. And that's a big shift.
It really is. But Jan, as you noted, traditional way of developing cars, it was very siloed. You had design, you might have powertrain engineering, chassis engineering, body engineering, all in different silos, separated from manufacturing, separated from purchasing. And I think that's not the way to do it when it comes to the software-defined vehicle. Is that right?
Correct. And you're exactly right. And that resulted, that siloing and that separation actually into departments, at both the manufacturer but also the supplier side, then resulted in, it's called a vehicle architecture, EE architecture, resulted in really each department, each function having its own tiny little computer called an ECU, an electronic control unit, in the vehicle, which then runs exactly the functionality of that one or very few functions. So one for the engine control, one for the braking, one for the driver assistance, ADAS system, and so on and so on. That has worked well in the past. The industry has also very much cost optimized that system, in that OEMs, manufacturers, could bid suppliers against each other for each building block of a car. But that architecture and also industry culture, purchasing component by component separately, does not translate anymore into that future expectation and future functionality required. In order to develop the functionality, coming back to the smartphone analogy you have on a smartphone today, you need one central computer or very few central computers which run much of the functionality of a car in the car. So one central computer opposed to hundreds to several hundreds distributed across the vehicle. And that really requires a complete development paradigm shift from many silos, very cost optimized, back to one computer in the vehicle. One computer in the vehicle requires one operating system, one so-called SDK, software development kit, that fulfills all the requirements of these different departments. So powertrain, ADAS, infotainment, and so on, which are different. Powertrain or the braking system, you have very simple software, but it needs to execute on time. For an ADAS system, you need to perceive the environment with cameras and radars, which is very complex. And for an infotainment system, you want to render a video for the passenger or the backseat passenger, maybe in 4K resolution. So very, very different requirements. The more you centralize, the more functionality fulfilling these different requirements needs to be integrated into one computer. And that's a challenge. And it's more than a technical challenge, it's a cultural challenge as well.
I would say it's probably an organizational challenge too, of going from these different silos or different areas of expertise to combine them into essentially one group.
Oh, very much so. You not only just one room, they actually need to work together on software that then runs on one computer, which is not how these companies have worked for the past 20, 30, 40 years.
That's right. So do you think they can pull it off? And as you know, for example, Doug Field at Ford has said Ford's going to write all the software for all the components for the very issues that you just raised. Can they pull it off? And not just Ford, but other legacies. And the reason I ask is this. Even though suppliers have been writing all that software, they have enormous expertise. I mean, whether you're talking the braking system, the steering system, or whatever part of the car it may happen to be. And so much of the knowledge resides at the supplier end. Moreover, do the legacy automakers even have the amount of personnel and the quality of personnel to be able to write all the software in-house?
I mean, currently they don't. And they've more or less all have realized that challenge. So the two largest automakers, Toyota and Volkswagen, already around 8 years ago, founded subsidiaries specifically targeting software development in order to be able to establish a software development culture. But such a cultural shift they noticed, it's apparent from what's public in the press, they've noted that cultural shift is just very difficult to implement overnight. And you need to strike the fine balance between implementing software in a modern, more agile way where people collaborate, but still retain all the knowledge and the qualities that these car makers have established over the past 20, 30, 40 years, which is a focus on safety, reliability, and so on. So you don't want your braking system requiring a reboot because it crashes twice a week, as some phones may do today. So that's the fine balance: safety, reliability, but more agile, working together. And that's just it's a fine line. It's a difficult balance. To your comment with respect to Doug Fields, I think it's foolish to expect to do that shift overnight and to bring all software development in-house immediately. It's just very much of a transition. And even the two biggest car companies have started that 8 years ago. And while they initially targeted a software release around 2024, so pretty much now, that has now shifted several years back, and they're now there at least not any public statements when exactly that software will come out. They're of course producing some software, but it takes longer than just a couple of years. So we've actually looked at exactly that cultural change with a couple of of our customers, or large ones and small ones. And what we have found is that the working paradigm needs to change dramatically, but they are actually faster if they do it instead of now currently 100 or a couple of hundred very distributed, isolated suppliers, to working with 1 to 5 core suppliers, which are actually tightly integrated, all work in one development workflow, opposed to before each supplier had their own development workflow. Essentially, what was flowing in the past from the manufacturer to the supplier was a set of requirements and then a purchase order. And then what was flowing back was a black box, either with hardware or just software, where the supplier shipped a piece of code. And that's exactly what Doug Field alluded to in that interview, that more often than not, the manufacturer doesn't even see what's inside that black box, doesn't even see the code. And for any requirement change, which requires a software change, they have to go back to the supplier to first describe that change, then negotiate the price, then implement it, then ship it back. And that then results in update cycles of 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year for very simple requests. My favorite example is how Tesla implemented and executed dog mode. Dock mode is a function in a Tesla vehicle where you can leave your dog in the car, you press a button, it turns on the air conditioning. It also shows on the screen very visibly that there is a dog in the car. So it requires that functionality to be added to the touchscreen, then in interface to the air conditioning, and you need to change the infotainment system so that you can display an image of a dog, and then you also want to watch the dog through the interior camera. Tesla, or a company like Tesla, having a software-defined vehicle, having all the software, access to all the software in-house, can execute that in a couple of days to weeks. For a legacy manufacturer working in that old system with suppliers, it takes months or is actually impossible to implement because some of the systems cannot be updated. That's
so
really the big.
Yeah. So Jan, what you're really saying too is automakers, following your advice, bringing in a handful of really core suppliers, they got to make their sourcing decision before they even start development of the car.
Or at least very, very early. You're absolutely right. Or at least very, very early in the process, where suppliers are actually integrated into what is the development approach? Where do you store the software? What is your approach to, it's called CI/CD, so the continuous integration of all software into one result. So the earlier and the tighter the integration, the better and the faster is the outcome. And to compare that to, I was about 2 months ago in Beijing at the Beijing Auto Show, where there were automakers, and not just tiny ones, that new automakers that started the decision to build a car about 3 years ago. And in less than 3 years, there is not just the car designed, the software is written in-house. They do work with suppliers, so you could see the braking system, the steering system was actually sourced from Western suppliers. But all the infotainment system software, the ADAS software is running on central computers, and the cars are already manufactured and shipped to customers. You can see them on the street in less than 3 years.
Mm-hmm. That's very quick. And one of the things that I loved you talking about, I'd like you to hear you go into it again, is the need for automakers to have small teams, maybe only 20 people, but the best software writers. Mm-hmm. And you may have to pay each of them $1 million mm-hmm. because that's what the best cost. Mm-hmm. And how legacy automakers, especially mm-hmm. here in Detroit, need to focus more on value and not on cost.
Yeah, correct. So that's not just Detroit, but also the more traditional European manufacturers. The challenge is they have huge organizations, and that's what I meant with the cultural shift. They have huge organizations. So their purchasing department, their personnel department, HR, they also need to be integrated into that cultural shift from, exactly as you say it, from a cost-focused organization to a value-focused organization. Yes, and that's hard. Some of your key architects may work better at night than during the day. If you require a 9 to 5 in the office job, that's sort of not just hard to implement, but it's also hard to get and then retain those persons. If they require some weird multi-monitor setup that is not in the corporate IT catalog, you're either not going to get those rockstar developers, or you're going to lose them the minute if you get them your standard off-the-shelf computer, of which you purchase 100,000 units. So that's really the challenge. Smaller teams, also smaller organizational units that are unable to make their own decisions. That is immediately suboptimal on the corporate cost level, because corporate perceives to lose control. But it's ultimately more agile, leads to faster results, so it does save cost and make you more competitive in the long run. But it's a huge cultural shift, which needs to be implemented. Yeah, that's the challenge. But that's exactly why those companies started their own units, and some of them actually operate in a quite agile way. Others do not.
Yeah. Another thing that you have talked about is you're not so keen on the idea of outsourcing software to low-cost developing countries.
Mm-hmm. It goes again back to what you pointed out, it's cost versus value. If you count software development cost per developer, then of course outsourcing it to a low-cost country somewhere in the East is cheaper on paper. But traditional automotive software development projects, they have hundreds to sometimes thousands of developers. And yes, again, if you count cost per person, then of course finding the lowest cost country is ideal. But you can actually do it with superior software, with superior methods, with agile software development, and very, very capable persons, which you usually don't get in those low-cost countries. You can actually do it overall much cheaper and also faster, with fewer bugs, fewer recalls, a more happy customer, and a more competitive product. But that requires rockstar developers, typically in a high-cost location.
Right. So what you're really talking about is whether it's an automaker or a supplier, they have to look at the total turnkey cost implemented, not just count individual the cost of individual software engineers.
Correct. And you need to ultimately accept that the way you calculated cost in the past doesn't translate to modern software development. And the Googles, the Apples, the Facebooks, Nvidias of this world, they have figured it out in such that their key developers are in those high cost locations like Silicon Valley, where I am today, or Western Europe, for the respective region. Of course, you can then outsource certain functions like software quality control or a detailed implementation of localization aspects into lower cost countries. But the architecture, the core development, the cutting edge technology development, that is more efficient being done where you find the best of the best. And you can work with the suppliers that provide you with the best of the best approach.
Jan, you mentioned that several automakers started separate software operations, all with the idea of getting to a software-defined vehicle. Here we are 7-8 years later. It hasn't happened. They've had to push it back a few years. But my understanding is Apex.ai has some tools that can slash the time of development. Tell us a little bit about Apex and what you're all doing there.
Correct. So we've implemented, it's called a software development kit. It's essentially software and libraries and tools that implement all the functionality that many or all of the functions and departments and developers developing car software need. It's from reading in data to transferring data between computers or processes to outputting data to methods implemented in software, how you guarantee safety and reliability. And if such a software system, an SDK, is introduced across all developers of a complete vehicle, that cuts cost significantly. The approach is again taken from the smartphone world, where Apple and Android distribute SDKs, software development kits, for free. You can actually download it from the Apple and Android website when you register, which then provides all the tools and software and libraries you need to develop a smartphone app. And that has enabled software development such that even high school students, without having to be an expert for embedded software development, can develop a software called an app for an embedded system called a smartphone, which is not that different from a car computer. With the major difference being software on a car needs to be reliable and safe.
So if a legacy automaker now takes, let's say, 8 years to develop a fully software-defined vehicle, using your SDK and your methodology, how much time could you take out?
Several years. So we have customers in the non-auto space. So some are in agriculture, like Krone, Lemken, and Echo. Or we recently announced a customer in the marine space, Brunswick, the largest recreational boat manufacturer in the US, using our software for automated or autonomous functions. With them, we often launch and kick off a project and then go to a product within 3 years or less than 3 years. They're, of course, smaller, more agile organizations, but that it shows it's possible.
It sure does. Well, Jan, I want to thank you so much for your time today. Very, very interesting what you're doing. And I love your insights into what needs to be done with software in the automotive industry.
Well, John, thank you so much.